Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm so thrilled to be here with you in Australia. It's my first time visiting. It's also my first international flight since COVID times, and like maybe my second flight since COVID times. So a little disorienting for sure. Fortunately, I got COVID right before I got here, so I didn't have to be worried about getting it when I got here. So I won in the worst way possible. I'm fine. I have a little brain fog and a little jet lag, so at some point in my talk, I might do this. Don't mind me. And also, one weird thing that was happening with my jet lag this morning when I was practicing my talk, I kept yawning, like a lot, like repeatedly. So if that happens to me again, it's not a judgment on any of you. I don't think you're boring. My brain doesn't know where I am right now. Okay, let me make sure I have all my things. So thank you, Karen, for that introduction. Thank you to all of the organizers of VALA for making it possible for me to be here, for us to be here together in person. I wrote the title of this talk when we were still fully trapped on the internet. I think we still kind of are, I'm gonna get into that, but some of the ways that our relationship to the internet changed, I think has persisted. So fortunately, we are able to actually see one another in person. But some of those conditions, I think, have persisted, and we're going to get into that today. So, as Karen said, my name is Alison Macrina. My pronouns are she, her. I am the director of Library Freedom Project. I have been working in libraries for about 15 years. I started LFP officially in 2015. It became my full-time work, but I started doing the work that would become LFP a couple years before that. I live in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and I am a really big Sixers fan. For anyone here who is a fan of the Philadelphia 76ers, we had a team member from Melbourne. Yeah, he cost us the playoffs last year. Sorry for the sports reference. So I've been organizing for community autonomy and collective power in libraries for about the last 7 years in my work at Library Freedom Project. I'm joining you today from a place where things are going really badly for libraries. There is currently, as I'm sure many of you are pretty aware, a coordinated assault on public libraries and schools and other institutions from various right-wing zealots, some of them organized together, some of them part of like sort of bigger institutional power, some of them just like kind of randos who started a Facebook group, but very, very active, very deliberate, aiming to stifle public discourse, eradicate transparent processes and professional judgment. The books that are most at risk are books about race, particularly about blackness, books about queerness. These are being challenged and actively removed. We are having laws proposed that would basically make it a criminal offense to have these kinds of materials in libraries. I'm not exaggerating. Librarians are being directly threatened. It's really, really, really hard, and I can't really get into it all right now, and I didn't plan to anyway, but I just wanted to name that because that's the context that I'm working in right now, that my colleagues are working in, that other LFP members are working in, and I know that all of you as library workers are in solidarity with us in our experiences as we fight in particular for our Black and trans community members and for the life of our public institutions. Today, I want to talk about our shared context, things that we have all been dealing with no matter where we are in the world. The sort of collective issue that we've been confronted with now that we are, 3 years into a global pandemic. And that is specifically that the people who have power when it comes to technology have exploited our global tragedy to usher in a high-tech, high-profit future which traces our every movement and later mines the data for parts. We now live with new expectations of being online 24/7, productive, trackable, available to our bosses, surveilled by our schools, personally advertised to, watched in many ways, but not actually seen. Further, many of these high-tech systems have been shown over and over to be discriminatory, some of them outright racist. Some parts of the new normal have been nice and convenient. You know, I certainly wouldn't have been able to deal with the pandemic without being able to connect virtually with my family and friends, without being able to online order food or whatever. But a lot of that convenience has come at a price, specifically that the pandemic has accelerated the dystopian tech future that was already the norm for many marginalized people around the world. Now the future, as William Gibson says, has become more evenly distributed. So even now that we're able to meet in person, all these new technologies have colonized parts of our lives. But not everyone was these are just some random pictures I found of these guys on the internet. Not everyone suffered from this. There are some people who have benefited greatly from the new normal. Now, these are some of the richest people in the world. I think you'll recognize all of them, maybe except for the capitalist pig in the corner. They have accumulated even greater wealth thanks to the new abundance of our data and attention, which are two of the most valuable commodities in the pandemic age. You know, Brandon Page made more than 65 billion. Mark Zuckerberg added 100 billion. Bezos is on his way to becoming the world's first trillionaire. He's not quite there yet, but he's very close. It's not just the biggest tech billionaires in the world that have benefited. I learned from the Greens that the 10 wealthiest billionaires in Australia increased their wealth during the pandemic by $68.4 billion Australian. Sorry, I'm like trying to make my thing go. There it goes, okay. Technology and big data has given a lot of very rich people some very illegitimate and undemocratic power in this way. Big data companies like Google, Facebook, et cetera, are some of the most powerful in the world, more powerful than many governments, and with the ability to shape government policy, which they can and do all the time. These companies are also now much more seamlessly integrated with governments, both in terms of providing core government functions and also in terms of how closely police and other law enforcement work with Silicon Valley. Police themselves around the world have tons of new sophisticated surveillance tech and invasive and discriminatory technologies like facial recognition proliferate both in the public and private sector. Advertising dominates the web. We can't do anything online without being marketed to, our clicks and preferences captured for future exploitation. And all of this technology has become really no longer an option and more of an obligation, and increasingly makes decisions about our lives without our input. But one thing that I try to feel hopeful about is that in the midst of this dystopia, not just the tech one that I'm talking about, but the pandemic, the erosion of democratic values around the world, the rise of the far right, we are undergoing a really big global change, a move towards social justice. Many new struggles for justice are emerging, and many are becoming stronger. Struggles related to everything from policing, housing justice, land justice and indigenous sovereignty, labor, trans and queer rights. The thing is, every single one of these issues has a relationship to privacy, because they all relate to technology, because we relate to technology. I could give you endless examples of these kinds of relationships. What privacy means for example, people who are fighting to unionize their workplaces, or people who are fighting against landlords or other discriminatory housing. But I'm just gonna give you one example just for the sake of time today, and I think it's one that is very dear to me, but also I think, given the results of your recent elections, seems very important to you all, and that is the climate. So there's two big ways that climate justice relates to privacy. So one is the way that climate activists are regarded when it comes to surveillance. Climate activists are some of the most surveilled people in the world. At Standing Rock in the US several years ago, the kind of surveillance that those activists were under included both surveillance technology from the private companies that were building the pipeline, but also all of US law enforcement, so local law enforcement, state law enforcement, federal law enforcement, including multiple different federal agencies. I had the fortune a few years ago of working with some climate activists in Uganda who are working on preventing a pipeline that's being built through Uganda via Tanzania. And these people are some of the world's poorest people, have, really like low-level Android phones, poor connectivity. The kind of technology that is being used against them to surveil their activities is some of the most sophisticated in the world. And it's particularly private companies, but also government forces. And those are just two examples of how climate activists have to deal with surveillance. The other way that surveillance relates to the climate is just the fact of data and how we think of data as something that's sort of like abstract. It's up in the cloud. It doesn't have a physicality, but it very much does. Data needs to be stored and needs to be stored under very specific conditions. It's extremely carbon intensive. And some of the, not just surveillance technology, but the way that technology is moving is becoming even more carbon intensive. Artificial intelligence, for example, requires enormous data sets. In order to make predictions, make inferences about human behavior. And so this is just one example of how privacy relates to another issue of justice. In this way, supporting privacy advocacy, supporting the privacy of your community members, means supporting a more livable planet. Privacy is essential to fights for more democracy, and less privacy means less democracy, because surveillance is a very powerful tool for social control. So conditions are very dystopian, but as I said, I do feel hopeful. And in part, I feel hopeful about the role that we can have in this fight as library workers. Privacy has been one of our core values for a long time. I think we fundamentally understand how it relates to the work that we do. What privacy means for example, intellectual freedom. You can't have intellectual freedom if you feel like you're being watched. You will self-censor, you'll change your behavior. We're already the place that people go for help with their technology. And our communities trust us and maintain their trust in us at a time of pretty precipitously declining trust in public institutions. We have always served the powerless, the people who need privacy the most. And now the future requires us to take more of a stand. In our unique roles, we can raise expectations about privacy. We can make libraries the place where people can address the unease they may feel about these invasive new technologies, ask questions about what it means for them, get answers. We can make privacy a priority and reflect this in policy, staff training, programs, and more. So this is what I have tried to do with my organization for the last 7 years. Library Freedom Project fights surveillance. We provide librarians and our communities with the skills and tools necessary to turn our ideals into action. I started LFP working as a librarian. I was a technology librarian, and I was very moved by the revelations about global mass surveillance that were revealed by Edward Snowden. And I got very obsessed with the story, and I learned everything that I could. And there were a few things that really kind of sparked something for me. One was I noticed that my patrons were talking about this story too. It seemed to be impacting them, maybe not like at the level of obsession that I was on, but still it was something that they related to. And I was already the technology librarian, so I saw, maybe there was an opportunity for me to start introducing privacy tools into my work. I already taught some tech classes. I was already responsible for the public computers. And so I started by trying to make some just very simple changes in my library. The first thing was I asked my director if I could install a privacy browser extension called HTTPS Everywhere on our public computers. It's a very simple extension. It's actually sort of obsolete now, but it essentially fixes a problem with websites where if they're supposed to be using an HTTPS security certificate and it's misconfigured, it will like correct the problem, right? So I asked her if we can install these, and then I started to teach some classes, and then I started to install some more tools, and it really just became something that snowballed. I started to teach other librarians in my area about what I was teaching. I connected with my local American Civil Liberties Union, and I brought a lawyer with me to these trainings, and the lawyer would explain things about our digital rights, some of the things that were happening with regard to the law and the courts, and then I would explain the technology piece. And it continued to gain attention, and I was able to leverage that attention into some pretty significant grant funding. And that was 7 years ago. And I've been running LFP full-time ever since, and I have built a community of privacy advocates across the US, and I'll tell you about them in a bit. But first, I want to tell you about the approach that we take to teaching privacy. So people ask me all the time, you know, what does privacy actually mean? And I always define it in relation to consent and autonomy. It's about you being able to make the decision for yourself of what you want to share and not have that decision made for you by particularly some more powerful force. So, you know, you make the decision every day to raise or lower the blinds in your home, right? You choose what you want to tell people about yourself. Even if you're the sort of person who doesn't necessarily relate to privacy, maybe you feel like you love to share, or maybe you're an oversharer or whatever, privacy still matters for you because you're the one who should be able to make those choices. Consent is a really big part of privacy too. You know, we talk about informed consent in the tech world, and you know, when it comes to all of our end user license agreements and things like that, consent is absolutely necessary to have privacy. Agency, all of these things are very related to each other. Another approach that we have is that we really, in everything that we do, we try to connect technology and privacy to power and other issues of social justice. So I talked a little bit already about how privacy and social justice issues relate, but specifically power, you know, when you think about how if privacy is a person's ability to maintain their autonomy and agency, you know, if we can think about how those entities that are responsible for the loss of privacy and for surveillance and all these things, they're some of the most powerful entities that relate to us in our lives, whether it's big tech companies, whether it's governments, whether it's police, whether it's bosses, whether it's landlords. There's almost always a power difference, whether it's an abusive former partner, there's a power differential there. We focus on practical strategies that are appropriate for people at all levels of technical ability, and we really try to prioritize different forms of accessibility, universal design, and you know, we're just constantly iterating on our work and our resources to see how easy and accessible they are for all audiences. We focus on both individual actions for harm reduction, so small things that anyone can do to reduce their impact surface, while also really focusing on building community for collective power, because those individual actions matter, they're important, they're a starting point, they will make a difference in people's lives, but we're talking about pretty big social issues, huge problems that we're facing like across the world, and in order to address them, we need to have collective power. The way that people join the LFP community, we have a training program called Library Freedom Institute. It is totally free. It's funded by the Institute of Museum and Library Services in the US, which is an independent federal agency that funds museums and libraries. It's an intensive training, 4 to 6 months, readings, conversation, lectures, etc. We have a different speaker every week. Sometimes it's me, boring. Sometimes it's someone more interesting, like this is Varun Mathur. He is part of the AI Now Institute, which is an organization in the US that is basically critically examining artificial intelligence and the role that it plays in our lives and asking all these really critical questions, not just about data and privacy, but also the labor involved in AI, the resource extraction, just making all these bigger connections. And I really try to emphasize getting the kind of speakers that we would not necessarily hear from at library conferences. Maybe we would get one or two, but we have people from all over the tech and advocacy world that have really interesting and unique perspectives to share. The content engages directly with real world issues. So, things like policing technologies, big data's political power, identity theft and fraud, advertising, a lot of the things that I've been talking about, the impact on advertising on the poor. And we try to make sure that our work is trauma informed as well, considering that we're talking about things that have pretty big and nasty impacts on people's lives. After people complete the institute, they're invited to become part of the LFP community, and most people do. The work that we then do together is a little bit of everything. We do intellectual freedom and privacy talks and trainings at conferences, at staff and service days, for our state professional organizations, all over the place. We build a lot of resources for teaching and learning, and I'm going to tell you about some of those in a bit. A lot of our members have various leadership positions in the library world in the US. I don't know if I mentioned this already, actually, but we're pretty confined to the US because of the funding. So just to make that clear, we snuck in a couple Canadians and a couple of Mexicans, but that's all that we were able to do is like North America. So if you know anyone who has money that wants to help us become more global, because IMLS, like I said, it's a US agency and they're sticklers about that. So anyway, a lot of our members have leadership positions in the library world. They serve on committees in their state professional organizations. They're part of ALA leadership. We do a lot of things to kind of help people be ready to take on those roles because, it's not just about caring about privacy and doing the work of that and understanding why privacy matters, but also being the kind of person who is willing to stand up and give public talks and tell other people why you believe these things and help them. We collaborate with a lot of people in the broader field, so tech people, lawyers, civil rights and civil liberties types, advocates, and we just are generally a very supportive and collaborative community of people in LFP are working on like a new privacy policy or program, or they're having some difficulty convincing their administration of making a privacy change. We're just there for each other and we help make all these things happen. Our community culture, I think, is really unique and special. We start kind of from a place of shared values. The way that I recruit people into LFP is we have an application and it's basically just values-driven questions. I want to know that these are people who care about others. We put the humans in our project first over everything. So this, has really been a big thing during the pandemic that everyone's well-being, safety, health, et cetera, is way more important than any work that we could do together. We also value solidarity with oppressed people around the world, even if they're people that we may never be engaging with directly. We try to have that sort of global focus. And then we just approach our work generally with a care ethic, being trauma-informed, trying to be accessible, universal design, things like that. Our code of conduct is very important. We have standards about how we treat each other and what we won't accept. Our probably number one recruitment criteria is around diversity, and I mean this in every sense of the word. Probably the number one is racial and ethnic diversity because, librarianship, especially in the US, is a very, very white profession. So we've focused a lot on making that not so in LFP. But also we want to have many other kinds of diversity represented, age diversity, gender, and sexual identity and gender expression, parts of the country. So we have many people from rural libraries, from big cities, and as well as people with all different kinds of job titles and people with way different levels of experience in the library world, because everyone brings a little something. I mentioned this already, but it's just a very welcoming, inclusive, supportive environment. We're big on destroying imposter syndrome, naming it when it shows up, and then eradicating it. And then lastly, I try whenever possible to get my people paid for things. It's not always possible, but considering how much work it all requires, how much people are expected to do labor for free when they're passionate about something, I don't agree with that. So wherever we can, I try to get opportunities that pay. Just some community stats. We have about 150 library workers in 33 US states, plus Washington, DC, a few in Canada and Mexico. We have no MLIS requirement. Any job title is welcome. You just have to work in a library. We try to focus in particular on under-resourced communities, so it's mainly people from public libraries and community colleges, but we also have like some four-year academics and such. Our community is about 40% Black, Indigenous, and POC identified, and we don't keep stats on people's gender or sexual identity, but it's very LGBT. So maybe someday we'll get a number on that, but it's a very super welcoming place. And this is just a lovely photo of it's about 1/5 of the community. We were very fortunate in August of 2021, we the tiny window between full vaccination and Delta, we were able to have a small meeting, and it was actually fully masked. We took our masks off for the picture, right? So just a lovely photo of some of our people getting to be together. We really do try to prioritize in-person stuff, so that was a special time. We do have another in-person thing coming up. So in the US, you can rent a summer camp in the off-season. And the off-season for us begins around early September, so it's still really nice. And so I've rented an entire summer camp for all of us, because then it's sort of COVID safe, right? It's mostly outside, so we're gonna have a big camp explosion. I'll send pictures after. So now I need you all to do the same thing that I have done. It's probably kind of overwhelming, but I promise that you can do it. And actually, you don't actually have to do the same exact thing, but there are a lot of things that you can do. If this is something that you care about, if this is a thing that you want to get started with, I really fully believe that anyone in this room can do something as special as what I have done, and I'll help you if you want help. So let's talk about how you can do that. Making privacy a priority. We're gonna say, find an area to focus on, get one piece that you can get really good at, get to know the basics, the best practices, the key concepts, and all you ever really need to do is be like one step ahead of your audience. And actually, I find that this is a very relatable way of being a teacher or trainer, because especially when it comes to technology stuff, people are so nervous about it and so afraid of asking a stupid question or saying the wrong thing. So if you let your audience know, look, I only just learned this myself and we're gonna figure this out together, it's actually a really big relief for everyone. And that's basically what I did when I got started. So I'm going to cover a handful of things that I think are good recommendations for library workers who want to get involved with privacy. Some of the things that we have done in LFP, and just some areas that you could focus on. So just so you know what's coming, this is what I'm going to talk about. Just some key concepts, basics, questions to ask of data and new technology, things to learn and teach, ideas for staff trainings, for public programs, for virtual and what I call passive programs, so like slapping a poster on the wall, vendor issues and policies, and then finally building support, because a lot of this work is really built on relationships. So the first thing, I mentioned a couple of these already, but I think it's worth repeating. Individual practices really, really matter. Even just teaching someone about better passwords or having their software updated, that might be the difference between someone in a, let's say, that the person whose abusive ex-partner is trying to stalk them on their phone. Having a stronger password might be the difference between their abusive partner finding out some information about them or not, right? Individual practices are a really important way to reduce harm. They're also just a really good way of getting started. We can plant seeds for something bigger. But in LFP, we always try to keep in mind that the individual practices are meant to build more collective and community power. We focus a lot on that harm reduction ethos, basically trying to do any small thing that can help people reduce their impact surface. And kind of as a piece of that, we try to have what's called in the privacy world having a security mindset, which is sort of just like being paranoid, right? Like thinking about what could happen, what could go wrong, how could this information be misused, and you're gonna see that in the data questions that I'm gonna get to in a bit. Just generally having a sense, a commitment to data minimization. That's right, it's spelled with a Z. With a Z. I was like, I'm ready for them to wince at the American spellings of everything. We do speak the same language. Data minimization, just a simple concept that wherever possible, just be reducing the data that you're collecting, whether it comes to library services, whether it comes to, ways that you might advise patrons. Trying to make it smaller means that the possibility for exploitation of all kinds also gets smaller. And just being ready to be the annoying person asking all the questions about the data and technology to make sure that privacy has been a key consideration. So here are some questions that I think are important to ask when it comes to any technology in your library, any data practice, any policy, really anything, any computer thing, anything that like blinks and beeps, right? What's the data being collected and why is it being collected? What are you doing with it? What are the benefits and who could be harmed? Where and how is the data stored? Is it using some kind of encryption for its storage? What kind of security is being used there? How long is it stored for? What is the deletion policy like? Who has access to the data? So this is a big thing with at least ILSs in the US where like there's one login, so everyone in the library can have access to all patron records. I see some people nodding, I guess it's a thing here too. Not just who has access to it, but who owns it. Because that's something that, now that we have all these third parties that we negotiate with who are collecting information, they are the owners of this data. We are not. When you collected the data, did you use informed consent? This is a tricky thing, right? Because there's a lot of ways that informed consent is talked about, a lot of different platforms that say they use informed consent, but it's not actually informed. It's like, oh, we flashed a 19-page EULA for you and we told you what was going to happen. That's not informed consent, right? Do the people who you're collecting data about know that this is being collected? Do they know what it's being used for? If you don't know the answers to any of these questions, you should not be collecting the data. It's simple as that. Now, I have this little asterisk down here. I was doing a little research about your fine country and I learned that the proposed reforms to the Australian Privacy Act, which I guess the new government it's something that they are supposed to be prioritizing, they seem pretty good. And they definitely address these questions. So, informed consent, they mentioned that one of the reforms is redefining personally identifiable information to be very expansive, which I think is great because lots and lots of data that is personally identifiable is not considered personally identifiable. Generally, limiting data collection, minimizing data, and also limiting direct marketing from data. So hopefully that will work out. If the reforms go through as written, I think it will be a stronger law than the GDPR in Europe, but you know, governments and political will, and who knows what will happen, right? So, you know, getting a sense of those kind of basics, the data questions, all of that. That's like the most like, you know, primary level that everyone should get on. The next level is maybe you want to teach other people about what you know. And like I said, you just have to be one step ahead of them. So we have some resources for teaching and learning, but just to start with some kind of like first basic things, right? Basic terminology and best practices. And we have some of the resources on the LFP website. We have like a glossary of privacy terms. We have a lot of links for like cybersecurity industry best practices. It's all pretty straightforward stuff. And I think, you know, given that a lot of you in this room are already doing tech stuff, it might be stuff that you're already familiar with. Teaching people strong passwords and using password managers is like, you know, you can get so far with privacy advocacy just knowing that, because people's passwords tend to be really bad. And it's such an easy attack vector, especially when we're talking about the impact on a lot of marginalized people, that you know, losing access to their accounts or getting identity theft or fraud or something can be so devastating. Something like that can be so helpful. Learning how to evaluate privacy threats without getting too scary. This is sort of a big concept, but a lot of our LFP resources do address this stuff. Data minimization, particularly for social media, kind of teaching people how to get into that mindset with regard to what they share on their different accounts. And then finally, using encryption standards for sensitive info, particularly things like texting. Email is a little bit higher tier, but even just getting a sense of how to talk about encryption and help people understand what it means to use encryption technologies. So we have a number of resources for you to learn about these things. And I'm going to flash this up again later too. So first of all, the LFP website, libraryfreedom.org/resources. There's all kinds of stuff there. There's some training materials, there's posters, there's bookmarks, there's zines. I actually have a bunch with me. I'll tell you about them in a minute. All the videos from Library Freedom Institute from our training program are at that Vimeo link. So literally all of them for the last 4 years that we've been running this program. We also have a lot of resources on our wiki. It's a little bit less like ready for prime time. So the website is like nice and clean and looks beautiful. And the wiki's sort of messy, but it's still a lot of really good stuff. It's sort of a workspace for us in LFP, but we have many, many, many additional resources there. And then a couple of non-LFP resources that I like. So the Electronic Frontier Foundation has a website called the Security Education Companion. It's just for people who want to teach about privacy and security. So it's curriculum and resources for people who want to teach, as well as another EFF resource, which is Surveillance Self-Defense, which is a little bit more focused on the individual who wants to protect herself. But both of those in combination are so good, especially for if you are just getting started, learning how to, you know, teach people about these things. Staff training can be all kinds of very simple things, helping patrons with privacy queries, understanding what the library's privacy practices are, what the privacy policy says, helping evaluate how data and technology is used in library services. I think that role-playing with staff is super helpful. In the US, a big thing that we role-play about is like what happens if law enforcement comes and wants access to some information. It's an uncommon situation, but it's not rare. And generally speaking, those law enforcement requests are about our most vulnerable patrons, homeless patrons, formerly incarcerated, undocumented people. And so getting a sense of how to respond in the moment is so helpful. And we do this for like people, you know, when they're newly hired, the last 15 minutes of a department meeting, staff and service. It's easy to insert just a little bit of privacy stuff into other work. For patron programs, keeping it super simple, 101 level, defining the problem. I recommend like no more than 3 things, maybe 3 to 5 if you're doing a patron class. So like just basic problem definition, understanding privacy, passwords, maybe like defining, you know, what HTTPS is, and a little data minimization, and that's it. You know, people will marinate on all of that for a while because it's pretty much all new information. I also really like including privacy tools in with other tech classes. So if you're teaching other like Computer 101, there's no reason that passwords shouldn't be in there. And people generally love hearing from like the sort of experts in the field that we work with, so civil liberties types, advocates, lawyers, et cetera. Since we are still pretty confined to the internet, a lot of our, that's so hard to read, I'm so sorry. It says virtual and passive programming. A lot of our materials are meant to be used entirely online. So just a couple of examples. We had a whole, we do a lot of webinar series, and there are links to all of these on our Vimeo page. This was a particularly successful one that we did. It was called Health, Privacy, and Literacy in a Pandemic World, I think. And we had a bunch of different speakers, doctors, patient privacy advocates come virtually and talk about, you know, patient privacy rights and understanding what a very misunderstood law in the US called HIPAA, which is basically like, it's the only health privacy law that we have. So just like relating it to things that were very much current and you know, that people had questions about and that they didn't have good places to go for answers. And in addition to the webinars, we have, we created a lot of social media shareables. So these are just some screenshots of, you know, the explained out patient rights, patient privacy rights issues, and we translated it into 6 languages. And part of the motivation for this was not just that we want things to be accessible and translated, but a lot of our LFP members who are from immigrant diaspora families had noted that a great deal of health misinformation was being spread via WhatsApp. So this is, I see people nodding, right? It was not in English, and we needed resources that address these issues that could be just sent over WhatsApp to people's families or whatever. And so that was a really cool series that we did. In addition to that, we have a whole bunch of other passive virtual materials on our website. On the left is a flyer that we made about Amazon Ring. It's like a little extreme, but I like the teeth. Amazon Ring is a surveillance doorbell. And in the US, police can access the footage really easily, you know, without a warrant or any other, you know, judicial thing like that. So we made a flyer about it. The other one is about stalkerware, which is the kind of technology that like, you know, someone might use to stalk someone else. So just some basic information about that. We print those out as flyers. We also have them to share on social media. A couple of others. This is part of a facial recognition poster. We have bookmarks. The Finsta project is a multiple zine project for young people that covers a bunch of different surveillance issues that teenagers face, so like educational tech and whatnot. So I actually have with me today a whole bunch of our privacy bookmarks. I have some of the stalkerware flyers, one of them translated into Spanish. And then I have a ton of these zines. I didn't cut and fold them, but I think you can probably handle it. I'll show you how to do it. And I also have a ton of stickers too, so you come up and get my stickers after. So I don't have a ton of time left, but I do want to talk about vendors just a little bit. I really just wanted to use this slide for them. Our vendors are doing a really bad job with regard to privacy and security. So just, I wanted to bring it back to the data questions to talk about this piece a little bit, because, you know, when it comes to our relationships with our vendors, they don't seem to be asking any of these questions. I'll just show you quickly. I know that this is probably impossible to read, but this is on the LFP website as well. So we did a survey of many of our popular electronic resource vendors. and their privacy policies. And we graded them on a set of privacy standards that were put forth by this US organization called NISO that had worked with the vendors and worked with librarians to like come up with a consensus standard on privacy. So we judged them on their own standard and they failed miserably. We asked questions like, you know, is there like what kind of cookie tracking is happening? You know, what data is even being collected about patrons? Is it PII? Is it something else? Who's it being shared with, et cetera? And no one did well. Most people did sort of middling, right? And we made this in 2018. A lot of these vendors they know that we made this assessment of them, and they haven't really made any changes. So just going back to my previous slide for a second, our vendors have some really major issues. They're not following industry security standards. They have really poor default settings that allow for a lot of privacy violations. They collect way too much data, and they use a lot of advertising and third-party trackers. They get away with it by naming it in their policy as like, you will never sell your data, but it's this slimy little like kind of middle thing where they're not actually selling it, they're like bartering it. They are sharing data with other third parties for advertising purposes. So what we need to demand from our vendors is, one, they need to get a better understanding of our library values, right? And they need to commit to them. We need them to follow just the basic best practices of the security industry. It's not a whole lot to ask. We need better transparency about their data practices. So one of the biggest complaints that we got from making that vendor assessment is all these vendors came to us and they were like, well, we're not really doing that. We just gave ourselves some wiggle room in our privacy policy in case we want to do it. And we were like, okay, cool. Like you can change your policy then, and they wouldn't change it. So we want them to be upfront and honest about what they're actually doing so that we can make informed choices. In the US, a number of our vendors have law enforcement relationships. In particular, LexisNexis and Thomson Reuters have multi-million-dollar contracts with immigrations and customs enforcement. And they use this to get around some local laws in the US that are supposed to prevent federal immigration law enforcement from getting data about individuals. So they just go to the private company, right? We want to end all of these partnerships. And we want to end all their third-party data sharing or sales. There's no reason why our vendors should be getting into any of that. I know that data is a hot commodity, but we already paid them once, right? They don't need to get paid a second time. All right, so we have so little time left, and I would love to hear questions. I always go over my time, but just to cover a little bit about getting support for your radical agenda. Privacy stuff is really built on having good relationships, and it can take a lot of work building consensus and allyship among people to make some of these things happen. So, you know, just a few kind of like organizing tips. Think about who in your library system gets listened to, who has a stake in this fight and can tell a story about it. One of the like tried and true people that I always go to for getting backup on these things is retirees, because they have time on their hands, because every library everywhere will like pretty much listen to them, and because they have a huge stake. I mean, older people, I was just talking to my neighbor, she's a retiree, she's in her 70s, and she told me that she's been scammed 3 times on the internet about, it's so sad and awful. She's trying to buy a motorized wheelchair, and every single one of the offers that she like, it's all a scam, and she has no idea how this keeps happening to her, right? And she's just one person. Real world examples of these harms are very, very powerful. Building consensus wherever you can, getting patron feedback. I love to do a class and then have a forum that's like, did you like having a privacy program? Do you want more privacy at your library? Everyone always checks yes to those boxes, right? It's an easy way to get the feedback to do more of the thing that you want. Couple of points of influence to build consensus and get more people on your side. Your professional library organizations, right? There's people there. There's people who already are volunteering their time for stuff, particularly the tech committees, privacy committees, e-resource committees. I don't really know how your state libraries work here, I'm sorry, but in the US, they do make purchases on behalf of the state for e-resources and stuff. Academic libraries, the faculty senate is a great place. I don't know what it's called here, but you know, the place that the faculty go together and then they talk, General Assembly, is a really great place to build consensus. Your union, because a lot of these are workplace issues, right? Workplace safety, as well as your IT department. Okay, I'm just flashing the resources again with a couple more information about the current training program that we have, Library Freedom Institute crash courses, the resources where you can find bookmarks, flyers, training materials. Our health and privacy series has its own website. You can check that out, our wiki. And then some non-LFP stuff that I included in here. LDH Consulting is Becky Yost. She's also in the US, but she's just an amazing, amazing privacy person who, if you want like an audit of your library's privacy work, or if you just like, if you need a lot of help to do this work and you need to hire a consultant for it, she's your girl. She's amazing. I've worked with her a lot in LFP. The ALA library privacy checklists are also really good for kind of like doing your own auditing. They cover basically a little bit of every area of the library, like public computers, e-resources, other kinds of infrastructure, and it's just a list of like, did you do X, Y, Z thing? I gave you those other ones already. And then just one more thing, a lot of the work that I have been able to do in the US, I was so fortunate to build partnerships with more powerful organizations when I got started. So the ACLU was one, Electronic Frontier Foundation was one, Tor Project was one. These are, if you're not familiar with them already, the main Australian privacy orgs. They, in my experience, you know, all the privacy orgs I worked with, they loved libraries. They were so excited to have an opportunity to connect with the public about this work. And, you know, if you have an experience like mine, they will help you. And then lastly, this is not an organization, just a really cool person that I have admired for years, Asher Wolf. They are here in Australia. They're the founder of Crypto Parties, which is basically like a party where people get together and they teach each other privacy stuff. I'm really sad Asher and I didn't get to hang out while we were here, but you should just follow them on Twitter. They're one of the best privacy people in the world, and especially in terms of like making things accessible, making things understandable, and making it like something that, you know, all different kinds of people can engage with. So yeah, anyway, just to bring it back a little bit, we can show people that something better is possible. We can live our values in relevant and meaningful ways that can make real change in people's lives. We can raise expectations in our communities about privacy, sow seeds for bigger fights. We can contribute to other struggles for social justice by helping people protect their privacy. I would love for us to get better at imagining the future, both the future that we actually want and the one that will happen if we don't act. So thank you all so much for your time. I would love your questions. We have 5 minutes left, but I can hang out. And please come and take my stickers. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, I think I need to grab to share.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for that, Alison. We do have some questions. One that's got a little bit of traction here. How do you engage with librarians that have a "I have nothing to hide" mindset?
I mostly don't waste my time, but I mean that. Like, you know, you're trying to organize for anything, right? Like you, one of the tactics that we use in LFP is something called power mapping, where basically like you have something you want to do, you map out who is like your strong supporters and your weak supporters and your strong enemies and your weak enemies, both in terms of how much they oppose you and how much power they have. I would only engage the people who are totally unconvinced if I need them for something, like if they're a decision maker. If they're not, like, I just let them move on with their lives, right? Because there's a lot of people who just want to be contrarian. That said, if you do need to convince them of it, I think that there are a lot of really kind of pithy, short, and maybe like kind of annoying ways to do it. One is that you can be like, okay, cool, please give me the contents of your wallet. Let me have your health records and your credit card number and whatever the Australian equivalent of a social security number is, and all these things, and they won't give you them, right? That really have people who say they have nothing to hide, it's either a failure of the imagination, or it's a way for them to signal to you that they're not the bad people that you're talking about, like the homeless people, or the formerly incarcerated people, or the trans people, or whoever. The other thing I think is, if you're dealing with someone who you think is just genuinely not sure, and they maybe can come to a compassion and understanding, I would talk about, you know, maybe they feel like they have nothing to hide, but if they were an undocumented immigrant, if they were a trans person, if they were a person who had some conditions of marginalization in their life, or is, you know, active politically in one of these fights that I've been talking about, that their view on it might change. I also try to imagine, like, you know, there are lots of different kinds of people who maybe feel that way about their current conditions, but then their conditions might change. You know, going with the climate example, a lot of the people that I met in Uganda who were fighting this pipeline, they were just like farmers before that, right? They didn't have anything to hide. They were just living their lives. And then suddenly one day, you know, a massive multinational partnership of US, Israeli, and Chinese companies comes in and builds a pipeline. In your backyard, your privacy, your threat model has just changed significantly. So I think that, like, giving some of these real world examples, maybe if you feel comfortable sharing your own examples, but, you know, I think in general, it's really good to have a good sense of which fights are worth having, because there are many people who will more readily be on our side. And so, you know, just being ready to make that calculation and not waste your time.
Maybe one quick one to finish up with. I like this one. What is the one thing I should tell my mum to do to stay safe on the internet?
Oh man, I don't know. Is your mom might be like a security engineer or something, right? Like maybe she's. I mean, I know I talked about them a lot, but like I think, you know, passwords are generally like the easiest kind of gateway, right? Most people's passwords are not very strong. They use the same password for everything, and if you teach people about having a strong master password and then using a password manager, it's way easier to navigate the, you know, password managers are really convenient. They'll like fill in the password for you. It's simple enough that anyone and any technical ability if they need help getting it there's basically no work to do to maintain it after it's set up. And pretty much anyone for any situation is going to benefit from that. So that's what I would tell your mom.